Wicked cool. Feature alert.
Hey there, podcast fans. Thanks for listening. Now, you can also reach out and send me a text message. On every episode, at the top of the show notes, you'll see a link that says, send us a text message. Simply click it, write something super nice and sweet, and away we go. Also remember to please subscribe, share this podcast with a friend by telling them about it, and leave us a positive review, whether it's on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast streaming service, or even on our website at www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com.
Tonight's episode is sponsored by the Haunting, Unearthly, and Paranormal Stories podcast.
Welcome to the Haunting, Unearthly, and Paranormal Stories podcast. Each week will be a different event, whether paranormal or some other strange and unexplained happening. Maybe even a haunting located near you will be examined and relayed to you. These events and stories are based on events have been given to us by the people who experienced these events in their own lives. These stories will take you to the depths of fear and back again. Pull up a chair and join me as we take a step into the unknown, here on the Haunting, Unearthly, and Paranormal Stories podcast.
If you want to reach out, email hupspodcast@yahoo.com or visit them online, if you dare, at www.hupspodcast.com. And now on to tonight's show. We've got a good one. It features Tim Weisberg, paranormal investigator, author, radio show host, and podcaster, best known for Spooky Southcoast and his latest program, Midnight Society. By the way, tonight's show will be posting on Sunday, March 20th, which just happens to be my youngest daughter's birthday. So Emily, happy 14th birthday. You make life fantabulous.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Tim is the host, creator, and executive producer of Spooky Southcoast, one of the world's most popular paranormal radio programs. In addition, he's an associate producer on TV's Haunted Towns and Ghost Asylum, as well as the writer-researcher for Ghost Stalkers. Tim is also the author of Ghosts of the South Coast and has contributed to books such as Picture Yourself Ghost Hunting and publications such as Fate magazine. A frequent contributor to paranormal television series and specials, Tim has been featured on programs such as Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures and Most Terrifying Places in America, History Channel's Monster Quest, Bio Channel's My Ghost Story, and Living TV's Conversations with a Serial Killer. In addition, Tim also runs the paranormal events company Legend Trips, along with Jeff Belanger. He's a frequent guest on other radio shows as well, most notably for his research into the hauntings of the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast in Fall River, Massachusetts. You can email Tim at tim@spookysouthcoast.com and follow him on Twitter at Tim Weisberg. And check out his radio show at www.spookysouthcoast.com and through the Spooky South Coast app. Welcome, Tim Weisberg. So happy to have you here, Tim. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
First things first, I know Tuesday is your bowling night, so how did you do last night?
Last night was actually one of my better bowling nights. I was surprised. Now, when I say better for me isn't necessarily what people would consider to be great bowling. There's some nights where I'm lucky if I can crack 100, but last night I came out first string, bowled a 145. Second string, I bowled a 164. And then the third string, I don't know what happened. The third string, I pulled out a 143, but it was a lot of work to get there.
So is this big balls or is this candlepin?
Nope, it's the big balls, 10-pin.
If it was candlepin, I'd be really super impressed with the 160. It's like crazy. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, those are great scores.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. And, let's talk about, the paranormal. To me, and this may seem like an inflated type of compliment, but you've been doing this a while. You're kind of like the Joe Rogan of paranormal radio to me, because you've been doing this for a while. You've stuck to it. Sure, there's George Norrie and there's Art Bell, but you've got that kind of younger, hip ethos to you, and you've had a lot of experience, and you bring kind of a freshness to it. So it's always a pleasure listening to you and listening to your show.
Well, thank you. I mean, we've always tried to approach it, way back when we first started doing Spooky South Coast, I had a little newspaper interview with the local newspaper that I also happened to work at. So a little bit of nepotism there in getting the article out. But the writer asked me, what is your plan with this show? How do you want to approach this topic that at the time in 2006 was almost still a little bit taboo? And I said, our approach is just this. If we take it too seriously, people are going to think we're crazy. And if we don't take it seriously enough, people are going to think we're crazy. So we've got to find that middle ground. And it seems that we've been able to do that over the years.
Yeah, your show started right about when Jim Harold's paranormal podcast began. I think he started in 2006. He's been on your show as well, correct?
Yes. Yep. And in those days, there was really very few other shows around. So if you wanted to listen to other shows, of course, you listen to Coast, but Jim Harold, Darkness Radio, these were the ones that I was checking out at first to kind of see how other people were doing it. Ghostly Talk, they're still around too. So it's amazing how small that community was to now we're at the point where people have thousands of these shows to choose from.
Yeah, it really is. It's a kind of a glut of paranormal shows, and it's tough to stay kind of fresh. In 16 years, I'm sure you've had some repeat guests. So who's been your Alec Baldwin, the person who has the most guest appearances on your show?
Probably Chris Balzano. For a while, we actually had him working as part of the show. He took over booking for a couple of years, and we called him our content director was the way that we put it. He was always such a great guest over the years, and I knew I could call on him to talk about pretty much any topic that we started working it into a regular segment. So he probably has the most appearances out of anybody. He is also somebody who I would actually consider, part of the OG spooky crew. So although he was a frequent guest, he's more like family.
Oh, that's great. Now let's talk about the rest of your crew, your co-host Matt Moniz and resident psychic Stephanie Burke. Can you give us a little overview about them?
Yeah, I mean, it's such serendipity that they came into my life because of this show. So it was Spooky South Coast that gave me two of my best friends. I started the show with Matt Costa, who has, since moved on to some other things in radio. But, him and I had been friends for a decade when we started doing the show. And we were really thinking it was just going to be the two of us. And by the two of us, I was going to dominate because he was more the behind the scenes guy and didn't want to talk. But then we were about 3 months in, and we were told that the sound guy from the local biker bar, we were working in a diner together, Matt and I. That's how we made our living in those days. And the biker bar sound guy was out front, and he wanted to talk to us about the paranormal. So we went out there, and there's Matt Moniz, who we only know as the guy that, does the sound. We had knew nothing else about him. And he says, "So what do you know about the paranormal?" And I said, "Nothing. That's why I'm doing this radio show." And he looks at me and says, "Well, that's the right idea. That's why I'm going to help you." And I did not realize that at that point he had about 20 years worth of experience investigating this stuff. He had worked with Bud Hopkins at the Intruders Foundation, Peter Robbins, Linda Moulton Howe. So he basically came in and gave us his Rolodex of people to contact and all of his files of research that he'd done over the years. So then he joins 3 months in. We have a good run of a solid, couple of years before I write my first book. And when I'm out doing a book signing, I meet Stephanie Burke at a local metaphysical shop. And she starts talking to me. She's like, "Oh, I read your book in one night." And I said, "Well, that's not really a compliment." We started going back and forth, and we started talking about Lizzie Borden and all kinds of other things. And I said to her, I'd like to talk to you more. And she would come in and hang out sometimes in the studio, but she would always hang out in the background. She never wanted to be front and center. But she always likes to tell this story where another psychic was in taking phone calls and giving readings over the phone while Stephanie was sitting on the couch behind her. And she was picking up on things, even though she couldn't hear what was going on because she didn't have headphones on to hear the calls, but she was picking up on things. And she was like, "Oh, that's this, that's this, that's this." And so I just pulled her aside afterwards and I said, "When you're ready to come out of the psychic closet, I want to be the first person to interview you." And so that ended up happening. And then, fast forward a couple of years after that, people had been complaining that it was a boys' club, that we needed to have a female perspective. We knew we were talking to a lot of psychics and didn't really have the knowledge base to ask the right questions. So I said it would just be a natural fit if you came and joined the show. And so she became the third co-host, and it turned into, not only a great addition to the show, but she's also become my best friend over that time.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is an Afraid of Nothing Paranormal Podcast Alert.
$10 merch. $10 merch.
That's right, podcast fans. If you go to our website, afraidofnothingpodcast.com, and click on the store tab, you too can find now $10 merch on the website. So not only can you get the great stuff like the hoodies and the t-shirts and the blankets and the glasses, you can also get stickers and bumper stickers and, well, a whole lot more. You need to see it yourself. But just remember this.
$10 merch
is now available at the Afraid of Nothing podcast store. Check it out. And remember, never be afraid to look good. Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, she was a guest on my show. This is like my third year, early my third year. It was called, I think the episode was Afraid of the Psychic Gift. I thought she was excellent. She was very interesting, and she was just an easy person to interview. I enjoyed it. It was one of my earlier, more popular ones as well.
Yeah, and she has a knowledge base about, people always want to talk to her about her abilities and psychic and mediumship, but she has a long history of investigating the paranormal even before she was out front about her abilities, and she does a lot of research behind the scenes on historical mysteries. I mean, she's a very fascinating person who really, I think, she downplays all that she can do sometimes, because she's been pigeonholed into that psychic medium thing. Not every time does she go to speak to a crowd should it have to be a gallery reading or a Q&A about psychic abilities. She can talk about a lot of topics.
Yeah, no, she's great. Does your show, it's a radio program, right? Does it still air on Saturday night, or is it a different time, or is it usually every Saturday night?
Oh, usually we do Saturday nights, 10 to midnight. We do have, because we're on terrestrial radio, we have to run the news. And I started doing this thing a couple of years ago, don't tell the management, where I just burn all the commercials at the beginning of the show so that it allows us to have like uninterrupted podcast forum conversations. And we've been doing that, probably the last 5-6 years, we've been utilizing that format. And I find it's much better than having to stop, taking a break. Because this is a topic where if you get somebody that's really opening up to you, you can't just put a pin on that and hold it, because you might not get the same responses when you come back from the break. So we had to make a few adjustments in how we were presenting it on the radio, but we are very proud of the fact that we are one of the few paranormal radio shows in the world that actually has a terrestrial home.
Yeah, and you actually go to a studio, or are you work out of your houses now, or how does it work?
So we actually go to the studio. Now, I had started doing a sports show at this station back in 2002, because that's what I was doing at the time. I was a sports writer, and we would go in and do the sports show. Well, actually, they wanted me to do it over the phone, but I said, "Hey, I've always wanted to be in radio. Can I come in?" And they let me come in, and I just became like a fixture in there. I was always hanging out, always looking to absorb more. So the program director called me one day and said, "Would you like to come and do your own show?" And I said, "Yes, but I want to do a paranormal show." And he was willing to give it a try, and I guess it worked out. So we've always been fortunate that we've been able to go into the studio. So we've never really set it up, unfortunately, for people to work from home. So during the pandemic, when the station was on lockdown, we kind of had to put the show on pause. Meanwhile, I got a job at the station full time in 2016. So I've been working in a variety of different roles there. I'm there every single day. And when we were locked out, I started doing everything I had to do from home. So I'm broadcasting, doing the news, all kinds of things from home. but I'm the only one. So I was like, oh, if only I had just been smart enough to hook everybody else up before this all happened, we could have kept it going. But so it's a plus and the minus of being in the studio, but I think it lends it a lot of credibility to guests that we're trying to get to say, we're on a radio station. And for some reason that still matters, even in this time of podcasts being the biggest thing in the world.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, with New England weather, like even the last week, like it's snowing tonight. It was windy, wicked windy 2 days ago. No snow on the ground yesterday, evaporated. It'll probably be gone tomorrow. I'm sure there have been some tough snowstorms and inclement weather, which you've had to trudge through to get to the radio station every Saturday night.
Yeah, I mean, we are also fortunate where if we take the night off, nobody cares. I mean, the audience might get a little upset, but like management doesn't really mind if we decide, hey, it's not worth coming in tonight because of the weather, solely because, they know that we don't get paid for doing the show. It's something we all do because we love it. And they know that, it's rough to ask somebody to come in bad weather. So for years, we had it set up where if we didn't show up, it would be dead air. So somebody had to go in and do something. And thankfully, we figured out how to put in some automation so that if we don't show up, there'll be something else to fill in that space.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of your shows for Spooky South Coast, but also there's a second show you do called the Midnight Society. So let's just give us a quick genesis of how that started and give us a little bit about that platform.
This came about because in 2000, I think it was 2018, Dave Schrader took over Midnight in the Desert, which was Art Bell's last show that he created before he passed away. And when Art passed, the current host at the time, there were some issues between her and the producer, and she ended up, getting fired. And they brought Dave on to be the full-time host. And Dave asked me if I would be his fill-in guy, for the nights that he needed to take off. And I said, sure. Knowing Dave Schrader's work ethic, I was like, I'm never going to have to do this job. I get to say I'm the fill-in host, but I never actually have to do anything. Lo and behold, he ends up getting the Holzer files. So he missed a good portion of a whole year going out and filming stuff. And I was constantly filling in. And then when they got season 2 of the Holzer files, it became even more obvious that he was being pulled in too many different directions. So I got the full-time gig. In January of 2020, I was named the full-time host of Midnight in the Desert, sitting in Art Bell's chair. Wow. And actually, I have some of Art Bell's equipment right behind me here in my home studio.
That's awesome.
And it really is. I mean, it freaks me out sometimes to know that I have like Art Bell's dump button. But anyway, the idea was that, I would kind of take over and just step in where Dave was stepping out. Well, at the same time, Keith, the producer, was trying to kind of make a step back, and he got an offer to purchase the network. So these people purchased the network. I got a phone call where they asked me, what my sensibilities were for all this stuff. They started right out of the gate asking me questions like, so, hey, this COVID thing, what a hoax, huh? I'm like, what? Huh? And so it became very obvious that they had a different sensibility than I did. And they were pushing more conspiracy stuff, and that's not my cup of tea, and I wouldn't want to be doing that stuff. And so they offered me a really, really lame deal. And I said, well, this is on a Wednesday. I said, can you just give me till Friday to think about it? I will still do the show tonight and tomorrow, and then on Friday we'll make a decision. And before I could get them in the decision on Friday, I got an email Friday morning saying my services were no longer needed. So fine. We were better off for it. But then it's like, well, what do we do now? And thankfully, myself and my producer, Michelle Freed, we had befriended Amy Martin, who had been working for Art Bell before, doing the news for Midnight in the Desert. And she had all the technical know-how to be able to build our own online streaming network. And so, again, Friday morning, like 7 or 8 in the morning, we get fired. By Monday night at 10 p.m., we had a brand new network with a brand new show ready to stream out to the world. So, kudos to Amy and the people that helped her put all that together, because we never missed a beat.
What was that first show? Do you know? And did you know how much of an audience you had for that first show?
So I'm trying to think back to who the first guest was. I think it was whoever we had scheduled from Midnight in the Desert. And we said, we're just going to move over to this different format. And to the guests, they were just like, yeah, whatever. We don't care. There was a lot of excitement at first. There were a lot of people who came over just to give it a try. There were, listen, I'm not going to have any illusions. There were people that were listening to me on Midnight in the Desert because they bought a subscription when Art Bell was the host, and they just kept going with it. And they didn't really support Dave or me or anybody. They were just there because it was habit. And so I'm sure some of those folks dropped off when they realized that I'm not Art Bell and I'm not trying to be. But we got some really good positive feedback from all the people who made up the Midnight Society. And that kept us going all through the pandemic. We were able to keep adding programs to the network. At one point, we were running something like 21 different shows every week. And I was doing Monday through Friday. I was doing Midnight Society. But then as time has gone on and as the world has kind of returned to somewhat of normal and we had to go back to day jobs and things like that, we had to cut back severely. So now I'm just hosting Friday nights on Midnight FM. And then we run a lot of like rerun stuff the rest of the time. But hopefully, you know, as we go forward and as Amy's schedule balances out, we can start adding back in some of those other shows that we were carrying. But, you know, for me, I got an offer to take over a daily talk show at my day job, and I needed to do that for myself. And so that meant if I was going to be talking for 3 hours a day in the morning, I probably couldn't be talking for another 2 hours at night.
Could you tell us the difference between Spooky South Coast and Midnight Society? What should listeners expect from each show, and how are they different?
We try to have a lot of difference between the programs so that it doesn't feel the same, even if like sometimes you might have a similar guest or somebody might be on one show and then a couple of weeks later on another show. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I don't want to be repeating myself and the audience doesn't want to hear that. So for Spooky South Coast, we've always taken things from a perspective of it's the crew. We're going to have some fun. We'll bring in some guests. We'll usually talk about snacks at some point during the show. It seems to happen almost all the time. That's why they call it Spooky Snack Coast now. You know, we try to keep it a little bit looser. And then when I'm doing Midnight Society, that's just myself and the guest. So that's a really intense one-on-one conversation. We were doing 3-hour shows originally. And the challenge that I gave to Michelle is throw anything at me. Whatever you want to book, whatever you think is a topic the audience would respond to, I will take any interview you give me and I will get 3 hours out of that person and make it interesting. And for the most part, we seem to have succeeded.
See, so my Joe Rogan parallel is kind of accurate then. That's good.
Not that we talk a lot about the same topics, but I'm very similar to Rogan in his style where I kind of let the guest have their say. I'll ask the questions that I think the audience wants to know, but I'm not doing this show to push my own agenda and my own ideas. I'm there to talk to interesting people that I think the audience will want to hear it from.
Yeah, that's what I like about you, Tim. I mean, the shows I've listened to, you give people a platform to tell their story, let their story unfold, but you bring a lot to the table, but you pick your times to add in your deep knowledge to it as well. So it's like you can have a conversation with anyone, but you don't have to dominate it. So I think that's great about both your shows.
Well, thank you. Michelle does a great job of finding the guests for Midnight Society, and she does a great job of challenging me. So she'll tell me, oh, we're having on this, UFO abductee. And I'll say, okay, I don't really know how much I'm going to believe all this. And then by the end of the second hour, I'm just as wrapped up in the story as the audience is. So I look at it as, it's not my job to judge. And Art Bell never really did that either. He might call people out if something sounded a little bit too hard to believe, but he tended to let people have their say. And I think it was a stronger program for it. So I try and do the same thing. We had a guest on recently. His story is that he was abducted when he was 10 years old from his bed, and he was put to work on Mars for 20 years in the 20 and Back program. And when I saw the notes for the show and I saw what the topic was, I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to buy into this. I'm going to have trouble, listening to this guy tell a story. And within 15 minutes of the conversation, I was completely enamored with everything he was saying because he told the story so vividly. And it goes back to kind of my approach. It's not my job to tell you whether or not to believe what the guest is saying. All I can do is present you the information, and then you make up your own mind.
And how much does your producer vet these guests before she lines them up for your show?
Well, I think for the most part, she does a great job of getting in touch with them. She talks to them about the topics. She finds out, what is the kind of things that they want to talk about. She gets a sense of what they might be when they're on the air. It's not a long pre-interview, but she tries to get to know who they are as people. And then she always comes back to me with, you're going to love them. They have a lot of great energy. Sometimes she might say somebody's a little bit bashful about talking about this. So just tread lightly, or you might be able to extract some more out of them than I could. But for the most part, she just gets the information that they want to present. And then she tells me to just turn loose and just gives me a couple of bullet points to make sure I hit.
And now an awkward interruption for some gratuitous self-promotion. Dearly beloved loyal listeners, we have another review. Shout out! Mark Travers of Tech Hub Pros writes, always cool, very different, and entertaining. Tired of politics and pranks? Afraid of Nothing is a journey into the unknown. I like that, Mark Travers. Very good copy. A very entertaining ride for all and topics you do not get everywhere. The podcast is definitely worth your time, so subscribe and enjoy. Be like Mark Travers. Please leave a review on Spotify, iTunes, or on our website at afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And don't forget to click that cute coffee cup icon and leave your favorite podcast barista a tip. Hey, the cost of everything's gone up except for listening to this show. Also, while you're on the website, visit the affiliates link, where you can peruse and buy books from all of our great guests, including tonight's guest, Tim Weisberg.
Please note, I may receive a commission for purchases made through my affiliate links. But hey, that's a good thing, right?
There have been some guests where, as everybody who's trying to book guests these days, especially in the paranormal world, you sometimes get burned. You sometimes bring somebody on and you book them, and then you find out later that there is some skeleton in the closet or some tweet that they put out or some sort of association they have that you don't want to have them on the program anymore.
Yeah.
And we've run into a couple of incidents where that happened. I mean, when the whole pandemic story broke out, when Dr. Judy Mikovits was making all the rounds in the media because they had released the trailer for this documentary that proved that COVID was a hoax and it was all planned out and all that, we were actually supposed to have her on the show that week, because we had originally booked her in January before the pandemic even happened, but we just kept pushing it off saying, it's not right yet to talk about this. It's not right yet. Finally, it just so happened that I said that week, like, let's just do it and get it out of the way instead of keeping her on the hook and making her wait all the time. But then all that stuff broke. And I said, well, I can't have this woman on the show, because if she's being accused of making up medical information and lying about her medical history, like, I don't know enough to be able to call her out on that if she spews misinformation. So we made the decision to cancel that show. And I lost probably half my audience for doing that. But you know what? It was the right move as far as I was concerned. And I wasn't worried about the fact that I was going to lose people. I was thinking more about the people who would have stayed and listened to that interview and what would have happened to them if they did get that misinformation.
Yeah, I would imagine, like, you've done close to 650 shows. I'm in, like, heading to 75 myself. Eventually someone has a skeleton in their closet that comes out, even if you interviewed them 2 years ago. It's going to be new to them, right, when they listen to that episode. So that's got to be tough. And those are always the most vocal fans, the ones that love all your shows, but they comment on the one where the guest is not aligning with their beliefs. So I think it's something that everyone's probably going to have to deal with. Which is kind of the downside of the show, of doing a show like that.
The problem is, too, is it's because there's so many platforms now. It doesn't even have to be the guest. It could just be the people that they're associated with. We had one guest who I love. I had him on one time already, and he was amazing. He was so funny, and the stories of the supernatural were great, and I couldn't wait. I wanted to have him on once a month. But then the second time we were about to have him on, I get inundated with emails like 10 minutes before showtime of people pointing out who he works for. The people that own the platform for which he was writing were putting up transphobic, racist, homophobic tweets. And I looked at the stuff that was being supplied. I looked at their Twitter feeds, and I had to call him right before the show was supposed to go live and say, listen, nothing against you, but I cannot have you on if that's the platform you work for, because I am not going to promote their platform and send people to a website if they're going to profit off that website to help them have a bigger platform to spew hate.
Wow. That's a part of the job. That's probably the worst part, right? That you still have to deal with on occasion.
You wouldn't think you'd have to. We talk about ghosts and space aliens and creatures out in the woods. We shouldn't have to deal with those kind of issues.
Yeah, totally agree. Looking back, I want to talk about some of your origin story, and because also you're not an armchair quarterback, to be honest. You go out and you explore the paranormal. So I want to, beyond just a show, I want to explore some of the places you've been. But I think I first want to ask you on Spooky Southcoast, when you look back, and I think I might know the answer to this one, what episode made the hair on the back of your neck stand up from a guest?
There was really one time when I felt like I was the most freaked out. I mean, we've heard some pretty interesting stories over the years, but there's always that level of distance. I'm sitting in a nice, brightly lit radio studio 400 or 500 miles away from the person that's telling me this creepy story. I never have to go to their haunted house. I never have to deal with whatever it is they're dealing with. But there was one time when the story got turned around on me. I've always been obsessed with the Amityville case. When I was like 12 years old, I was at a flea market. My dad had a table selling auto parts, and I would get a couple of bucks for helping him out for the day. So as I'm walking around looking for a way to blow my couple of bucks, I find a paperback copy of the Amityville Horror for like $0.25. I pay the money, I go back to the table, and I just start reading that thing, and I probably finished it that day. I was so wrapped up in that story. Then I watched the movie, and it just became the case that I was obsessed with. And over the years with Spooky South Coast, we've done a number of episodes, talked to people who were involved in it, getting to talk even to Christopher Lutz, talking to Laura DiDio, the reporter who covered the story. I mean, just getting into the minutia of this case. And as this was going on, Jackie Barrett was friends with Chris Balzano, and he was booking our show at the time. And he said to her, like, you should talk to Tim, because she had become the spiritual advisor for the Amityville murderer, Ronnie DeFeo. And so we planned on, having an episode where we might connect. She said to Chris, Ronnie wants me to write a book about his story, and I want you to help me. And Chris said, well, I don't really have the space in my life to do that, but you should have Tim do it, because he's obsessed with the case and he's an author too, so he can help you. So we had a preliminary agreement for me to help her with the book. Then she calls me up one night and says, hey, listen, we can't do this. I have to do this on my own. Nothing against you, but I can't put you through what's going to be involved in writing this book. I'm thinking to myself, she's just trying to hog it all for herself. And then when we actually had her on and I actually had a chance to read the book, I realized like just how bad and dark the stuff was around Ronnie DeFeo. And so she was going to come on, and I tried to connect with the prison to have Ronnie DeFeo call in even for 15 or 20 minutes as part of this interview. And the warden told me, I'm sorry, he has used up all of his media interviews for the year. We only allow them so many, so you can't have him on. All right, totally understand. And I'm on the air relaying this story to Jackie, and Jackie interrupts me and says, oh, well, I have a message for you from Ronnie. And like all the blood just drained out of my body. Huh. And I said, Ronnie DeFeo, the Amityville murderer, has a message for me? And she says, yes. He says for you to stop looking into the house because it's looking back at you.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly the story I thought you were going to say, by the way, that I wanted to have you share. That's awesome.
It still creeps me out to this day. I've had the opportunity to go to the house. We filmed a documentary that aired last year on Tubi, and we actually got to go and conduct a paranormal investigation. We couldn't get inside the house, but we got as close as anybody's gotten to it. In fact, we had special permission from the city to park outside the house, and we conducted an Estes method session. And also I had Stephanie, using her psychic abilities. And when we left the house, I felt like I got some closure in the case because, first of all, I got to lay eyes on it for myself for the first time, but also because she felt, and it seemed like the evidence was pointing to, that whatever was there went with Ronnie. That when Ronnie died last year, when Ronnie passed away, whatever this was went with him. So the family is free, the house is free of all this type of negative activity. So hopefully that means I am as well.
Now, that documentary, was that called Famously Haunted Amityville? I mean, that's one of the recent shows you've been in, or is it a different one?
Oh, that's the one. It's supposed to be the first of a series of famously haunted documentaries where they look at other cases, but they came out of the gate with Amityville, and I thought they did a fantastic job of presenting all sides in that story.
What about the shock docs? There was a shock doc on Amityville too, right? Did you see that?
It was, and I enjoyed it, but I also felt like that was just a lot of the same. I think if you were somebody that had been following the case and knew about the case, there was nothing new or groundbreaking in that. I felt like with the Tubi documentary, Famously Haunted, they did bring in kind of the idea of who is the next generation of people telling the story. So they brought in the TikTokers who were really jumped on Amityville as one of the big stories to share on social media. And I was like, listen, why are you giving TikTok people TV time? I mean, come on, it's a fad. Yeah. But it was that experience that led to me getting to know some of these folks and realizing they are just utilizing a different format to do the same research that other people have been doing for years and to keep those stories fresh in the mind of the next generation of investigators.
Yeah, was it one of your most recent guests? Was it who was also with you at Oliver House? We'll talk. Was it Stephanie Forlani or Stephanie Forlini?
Stephanie Forlini. She's very big on TikTok. She has a podcast, Spirituality with Steph, and she looks at things from a very, very unique perspective. She has, I would say, evolved probably more than most people already have in terms of her consciousness, and she's trying to spread that word for people, and that's a very interesting thing to bring into the paranormal side of things. Like getting to go and investigate with her at the Oliver House was different because Stephanie Burke certainly has that same level of awakening to some degree, but she also focuses in on certain things when she's on an investigation because she knows how to best utilize her gifts to get answers to the questions. And Stephanie Forlini, she will tell you herself, she's only been on a handful of ghost investigations, so it's all new to her. And whatever happened that night, she opened herself up to things. And we had some pretty incredible experiences, not just while we were there, but even the next morning after we had gone there getting evidence.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. I just want to confirm. So Jackie Barrett, the book she wrote, was that The Devil I Know, My Haunting Journey with Ronnie DeFeo in the true story of the Amityville murders? Was that the book that she worked on?
Yes. And not only is it about Ronnie and the Amityville case, she also dives into her own background. And her mother was a voodoo priestess. And her mother was called to remove the worst of the negative spirits that would attach themselves to people. And Jackie didn't think she would ever kind of follow in those same footsteps, but as that book tells the story of, she found herself dealing with Ronnie DeFeo and having to pull the evil out of him. And so she ended up following in the footsteps she never thought she would.
Oh. And going back to the Oliver House, I was there once when I was making my documentary, Afraid of Nothing. I visited Lizzie Borden. I visited S.K. Pierce. And then I went to the Oliver House. And this is before they have all the really cool people now and they kind of know how to manage it. I actually got some great footage. I was there with a guy named Mike Markowitz. We interviewed him. We did some EVPs. But they never signed the release because the town clerks were still figuring out how they wanted to manage the site. So I wasn't able to use that in my documentary. But I know since then they actually have some really cool people there. I think Christy Parrish was one that was recently on your show, and they're just really good to work with. You were there recently in February. I think you took Stephanie there because you wanted to give her a good flavor of what a good site is, and you want to talk about kind of that, why the Oliver House is so interesting, one, because there's this whole history side of it, and then what you experience. And I think the basement and a 2x4 over a door is kind of two crazy things that might have happened that night.
Yeah, and what's great about the Oliver House, and the reason why I selected this as a place where I thought she would be able to kind of learn the rope, so to speak, of ghost hunting, is when you're there, they don't get in the way of the investigation. They kind of let you do your thing. And Christy and I have known each other for well over a decade. She used to come to our events, and that's how she started her first paranormal group, and all of the stuff that she does now. Like, she'll tell you, it all came about from getting out there and doing these investigations with us. So we have just a natural trust for one another. And I knew she would be somebody that would not only be there to just open the door, but also to help me teach as Stephanie was trying to learn more of this stuff. And so we went there thinking that it was going to be similar to other investigations that I've done there, where there's usually a good amount of activity, but it's also it's low level stuff to let you know that it's there. But we were really getting some deep, meaningful connection. We tried an Estes method session in one of the upstairs rooms. Stephanie was able to go under, and she really had some really good connections with that. We saw some shadow people in the basement, which normally happens there, but there was a new experience for her. And then we were getting all these little signs of stuff. We put her in the psychomantium that they've built in the upstairs bathroom. And as she is looking into this mirrored surface and looking at a reflection, she's looking to see if anything kind of pops up. And she had myself and another person that was there in the room with her because she didn't want to be alone with this. And as we're sitting there, I saw what looked like an owl face come over her face. And I was like, that's odd, an owl face. So later on, we're in one of the rooms downstairs, and we're using I have a Ouija board from 1909. So we're using that board in this room, and we were getting a lot of good connections through it, including one of the Sprout family who wanted to tell Christy how much she loves her and the work that she does at the house, which was very moving. But then as we're sitting there doing it, we happen to notice that there was a painting of Lafayette in that room. And Lafayette was associated with the Revolution, with Ben Franklin, so it all ties into the history of the Oliver House. And then as Stephanie walked over there, she kind of freaks out a little bit. And she's like, Tim, look at this family crest for Lafayette. And when I looked, it was the owl face. And I was like, oh, and we were getting Lafayette-related stuff coming over the Estes method session, so it all kind of tied in together. So all that happens while we're there, and we think that, we've had some good connections and good communication. Well, the next day, Christy sends me a message, and she's like, yeah, I went to the house this morning, and I looked at the security footage, and you have to see this. And she sends me the little clip. Now, the basement to the Oliver House, it has across the wooden door one of those wooden 2x4, like, bar the door type closures. And there's a couple of metal brackets, and you have to slide this board into those brackets, and that keeps the door from being able to open. This is because they have a downstairs, a bulkhead into the basement, so they want to make sure nobody that gets in the basement could ever try to get into the house. Well, what happens on this bit of footage is you see this 2x4 kind of slammed down and make a noise when it was securely locked the night before. So somehow this thing got removed from there and then comes down and like slides itself back into place. It was incredible. I put it up on TikTok, which I'm, not really great with TikTok, but it turned out to be the biggest video I ever put out there because people just couldn't believe what they were seeing.
Yeah, and when it came out, it slid out. I mean, it could have just like hung down a little bit because the other bracket could have held it up, but it actually fell down and hit the floor, which took a certain amount of extra energy to do that. I mean, I think that was kind of what blew her away as well, as if I recall the video.
It's similar to another event that I had happen there. One of my first major events that happened there where there was a picture hanging on the wall and something had pulled that picture down from the wall. And when we looked at it, we're trying to figure out how this could have happened. Well, the picture had on the back of it one of those sawtooth brackets, and the nail that it was hung up on was actually pointing up at a 45-degree angle. So if you're going to sawtooth onto that nail and make that connection, that means the only way it would come down is if something got underneath it and pushed it up and off.
Yeah.
So that's not just somebody like walking on a floorboard or the staircase and shaking it off. That takes some force and some intention.
What's great about that house is it really is a mix of history. If you just love history, you could go there just for the history aspect. And I don't know enough to kind of restate it correctly, so I'll just leave people to go to the Oliver House website to find out about that. If you ever want to go there and do a tour, they do a ton of events. It's very reasonable for tickets and stuff, so it's very within anyone's means if they want to check it out. But then there's the paranormal aspect. Do you find in your kind of experience, is it residual or intelligent that you get from the spirits there?
Oh, it's definitely intelligent. I mean, they are interacting with Christy on a regular basis and her team. All the volunteers that are there, they have developed relationships with these spirits. It is certainly something that is not only intelligent, but also, I would say it's something that is intentional. Like, we are not just happening upon their space and they realize that we're there. They know who these people are. They know what they're doing. They know that they're there to help raise money and keep the place going, and they appreciate that. And so they reciprocate it. When we can get a location where we can keep it alive historically and where the spirits are on board with what it is that we're doing, that's when you know that you're doing things right. Because too often for us, we worry so much about what's happening on this side of the veil. But if the ghosts aren't happy with it, eventually you run the risk of they're just going to shut down and never talk to you again. Whereas this seems to be more of a symbiotic relationship where the spirits of the Sproats and the Olivers and everybody else that's living in that house, they appreciate what's going on and they want to see it keep going. So they're going to keep interacting.
So these are mostly spirits from the 1700s or 1800s. I think it's more the 1700s. It's not like any dark entity or demonic force that's been on the land and from a curse or anything. This is more people from that revolutionary or pre-revolutionary era, do you believe?
Some of them also come from, the later families that live there. There's probably not a lot of stuff from the last century or so because of the fact that for a while it sat and it wasn't being used. And then also a lot of the family that was involved in there it's kind of still around. History needs to be remembered, but if history is being remembered, it doesn't always try as hard. So maybe these spirits that are from these older generations, they want to make sure that they're not forgotten. But the people who have lived there in the last 100 years or so are like, we're good. Give the spotlight to Ben Franklin and Lafayette and the Sproats and everybody else. We'll just sit on the sidelines.
Beyond the Oliver House, I mean, there's a ton of great places. I mean, right where I'm in Westminster, like a mile down the road is the S.K. Pierce House. You've been there. I believe you've been to Lizzie Borden. You've been to the Conjuring House. Is there any place either in Massachusetts or that you've traveled outside of New England to, that one place that you visited that really left an imprint on you for good or for being scared out of your wits?
I think one of the first places where I really kind of had that experience was, it's in Massachusetts, but just barely. It's out in the Berkshires, the Houghton Mansion, which has been focused on all those paranormal shows. That was a place that, I was a real jerk before I had my experience there, where I would expect these ghosts to perform for me when I went somewhere. I would say, hey, tell me who you are, who killed you, how long have you been dead? Like, I was very forceful.
Yeah.
And it was going there and having an interaction with a shadow person where the shadow person actually shook my hand. And when I felt that hand wrap around mine and start pumping my arm up and down, tears started flowing from my eyes. And that's when I changed and I realized, cliche as it sounds, ghosts are people too.
That's a t-shirt. That sounds like a t-shirt, Tim. That'd be great.
Yeah, I should probably get a bumper sticker made for my car.
Ghosts work people too. And so it wasn't a negative thing. They weren't mad at you for being antagonistic. It was more like nice try, guy. We're here. Hello. That sort of thing. Or
yeah, it was more of a matter of, because it was a lesson I had to learn, and it was a lesson I had to learn to be able to grow as an investigator. And it has certainly paid off, because I have gone to plenty of places since where if I didn't have the right tact, I probably would get no reaction at all. In fact, we would do a place outside of Salem called the Parson Barnard House. And this was a house that is tied into the Salem witch trials, because the way the story originally went was that Reverend Thomas Barnard was one of the accusers in the witch trials. And he was the one that's, led to a lot of these people being killed. Well, as it turns out, just a couple of years ago, the Historical Society discovered all kinds of documentation that said that he was not an accuser, but rather he was trying to exonerate the accused. And he was on their side, and he was trying to help them avoid these charges of witchcraft. So that led us changing up the way that we would, interact with him. And we actually went there for the first time with this new information on the anniversary of his death. And when we went there, we went with this new mindset, and we got completely different activity than we'd ever gotten before. It was far more cooperative. It was far more welcoming. Now, there's still a bad spirit that lives in the attic, Simeon Putnam, who's a former school teacher when that was a boys' school. I think he's always going to be a jerk, and we're always going to butt heads. But it was nice to see. It was almost like Parson Barnard, Reverend Barnard, was like, well, you used to come into my house and yell at me and call me all kinds of names and everything. But now that you want to be civil, I can be civil too. And it's one of those moments where you realize, like, there's a humanity behind this that you have to respect.
Yeah, I had one of my guests was, I forget the name, it was Soul Sister Paranormal just a couple episodes ago. And it's an all-female crew, and they go in very respectful of her, because I'm like, have you ever had any negative things? And they're like, well, no, we just go in and we're not disruptive, and we're very respectful. And they're like crazy. They'll have 10, in 10 rooms, they'll have 10 recorders, and they'll listen to every minute of the EVPs and record it, and then do a great job of sharing it online. So they're kind of like a new breed coming of researcher, which is really great. It really is, with anything, how you approach something and how you treat that location of what you get back.
Yeah, and it's a lesson that I think a lot of groups could learn from. Look at it like this. This is how I try to present it to people that are coming to these events for the first time that I put on and have never done any kind of paranormal investigation before. Think about this. If somebody walked through the front door of your house and just got right up in your face and started asking questions like, who are you? What is your name? How did you die? Like, you'd get pretty annoyed, and you wouldn't necessarily want to interact with those people. But if somebody is polite, if they knock on the door, if they ask to come in, if they start asking you questions about everybody's favorite thing to talk about, yourself, and they start asking, what's your favorite food? What are your hobbies? That would be a conversation somebody would engage in. So you have to kind of, lay that groundwork at first, and then you can start asking some of the harder questions.
Researching you, Tim, there's some of your thought processes and some of your beliefs. And I wanted to kind of get into to shift to that a little bit, if you don't mind. Jeff Belanger, whom I believe you run legend trips with, once said to me, and probably said to many other people, ghosts are history. And I read one of your interviews where you said that you're not convinced that ghosts are actually dead people, but you're open to a continuation of consciousness after our earthly body stops, right? So what is you may not have the answer like most of us, but after 16 years, what is your thought about ghosts? And what do you think happens to most people once they pass?
Yeah, it's ever evolving for me, but I can talk about where I feel I am at this point in time. And when I first started, I thought, like everybody else, that ghosts are the souls, the spirits of people who have passed on. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that if there is a soul, if there is a spirit, there's no reason for it to get trapped behind. That doesn't mean that it can't be the intelligence of a person who has passed on coming back and interacting with us. But I think that all this happens because there is some sort of otherworldly energy that surrounds us. And I have subscribed to this theory. It's kind of the unified theory of everything in the paranormal, where whether it be ghosts, aliens, cryptid creatures, psi abilities, these are all coming from the same outside intelligence. So aliens aren't, extraterrestrial beings traveling across the universe. They are something that is here surrounding us all the time. It's just the form that this energy takes. And that's probably what a lot of ghosts are, that it is the energy that surrounds us trying to interact with us. And how does it interact with us in a form that we would most likely associate with ourselves? So it's going to appear as the form of maybe a shadow figure or an apparition or it's going to do things a human being would do, like speak out loud or knock on a door. So you're getting the interaction with this force, for lack of a better term, but it's doing so in a way that you can process and understand. And that maybe whatever that force is, those who have passed on before us are able to come back and utilize that to interact with us.
Is that kind of aligned with tulpas or thought forms? I also read that's something that intrigues you. Is that kind of where it's how our brain interprets and picks up on the frequency of the energy around us and what we perceive, the symbols that come to us? Can you talk about tulpas and how that kind of intrigued you?
It's the other way around for me. I think that these are actually things that we are putting out there with ourselves.
Oh,
so just as that energy exists around us and can interact with us, we can utilize that energy. And listen, it's an unpopular opinion, and a lot of people get mad at me when I say it. But I think a lot of these, quote unquote, famously haunted places that people are going and touring again and again and again and having these paranormal experiences, I think a lot of them are probably experiences that are being created by the person. Because if you go to, for example, the Lizzie Borden house, and you've heard all these stories for years about how Lizzie Borden's spirit is there or Andrew Borden's spirit's there, you're going to go there automatically expecting to interact with those spirits. And if we have the ability to manipulate that energy that's around us, even if we're not aware that we're doing it, we're going to put it into that form because that's the form that we're expecting to encounter. So yes, the door could close on its own. The lights could turn off on their own. The EVP could tell us that its name is Lizzie, but that's all something that we're doing unconsciously and unaware, but we're doing that and it's taking the form that we're expecting it to take. And, I find that to be just as fascinating, if not more fascinating than the idea of it possibly being dead people, because I would like to think that that is something we could probably never master, life and death, and being able to come back after death. That's something we'll have to wait to learn. But if this is an energy that's around us and we can learn how to manipulate it, that's something that we can put to practical use. And I always say, I would much rather think that I can sit on the couch and make the remote on the other side of the room come and fly into my hand Jedi style than to think that my dead grandmother is watching me while I'm in the shower.
Yeah. Great example. What are your cohorts? What does Stephanie Burke and what does Matt Moniz think about that? Do they agree with you or do they argue with you about that?
Stephanie definitely argues with me because she has the ability to see and hear and interact with these spirits. So to her, they appear just like you and I do, as solid people. And she had to learn discernment to learn which are the people that are living and which are the people that are dead and when to turn off the dead people so that she can interact with the living. So it was a struggle for her to kind of figure all that out as she went along growing up. So she definitely feels differently about the nature of ghosts. When it comes to aliens, she doesn't want anything to do with it. Moniz and I, we can kind of go back and forth with all different kinds of theories on ghosts, and he's willing to listen to all of those. But when it comes to aliens, he does not like my theory of it being, like I tell him all the time, I'm like, well, aliens are just the modern day boogeyman. 200 years ago, we called them fairies. Now we call them aliens because as we advance as a society, we need our boogeyman to advance as well. So what used to be the shadow behind the door is now the alien coming down from space. And we get into arguments because he is an abductee and he has been taken aboard their ships and he has gone through interactions with them. And he thinks that I'm all wet with my ideas because he's been there and he's experienced them. Even though I still think all of those experiences are valid and could have still happened, it doesn't mean that these things traveled, light years across the galaxy. I've been fortunate enough to have Neil deGrasse Tyson on my show twice. And both times he would explain in great detail why aliens would be physically impossible to have any kind of biological entity traveling that kind of distance. But also all the people who have had these experiences can't be making it up. So I have to find the middle ground between what the cosmologist is telling me and what the abductee is telling me. And to me, it just makes sense that there is an experience that happens, but it's probably not a ship coming across time and space.
Which is kind of a good segue to that episode I mentioned. I think it was, what episode was it? 645 of Spooky South Coast. And I recommend people check that one out as well as the rest of your shows. The last part was about the evolution of your believing people with claims of UFO abduction, I guess to a certain extent anyways, near-death experiences, and reincarnation. Now, was it because you're more open-minded as you get older and get more experience, or was just concrete proof presented to you, or a combination of the both?
Listen, I don't think that I am any more evolved than I was 16 years ago. I probably have been, but I still feel just as stubborn about some things as I did then. What happened was, I think in those days, I didn't have enough of the knowledge base to really make a decision that was sound. So for me, reincarnation sounded ridiculous to the 16-year-ago version of myself, because I do try to approach things from a very rational perspective. It was only recently that we did a reincarnation week on Midnight Society, where Michelle booked 5 straight nights of people who had reincarnation stories to share. And these aren't just somebody coming on and making up a story. These are things that were like documented by ABC News. And these are stories that were very well researched. And I'm hearing all this information and I'm thinking to myself, there has to be something to this. Do I think that it's necessary that this soul lived before and that this soul came back in a different form? I don't know if I'm willing to believe that. But if I think that there is this greater energy intelligence around us, why couldn't some of the previous intelligence of another person kind of be downloaded into a new body? And why can't it be kind of mixed in with the consciousness that's in there now? And I've really kind of learned to believe that consciousness is not this, it's not this individual thing that we try to ascribe to it. That really, I like to use the internet example. Consciousness is the internet. We are all just the individual machines that are able to connect into the internet, and we can download that information. We can upload our own information to it. But in the end, when you turn off our machines, that doesn't mean that the internet goes away. And so that's what's happening with our consciousness. If you turn off our physical bodies, that consciousness remains. And so if every experience that I've ever had is going to be fed into that, if there's going to be a website of my life somewhere out there in the consciousness, well, then another machine should certainly be able to log into that website and download the information.
So is the universal internet, is that kind of like a record where depending where you drop the needle, that's the song that plays, but everything exists at the same time? Do you believe in past, present, or future, or do you think time is just omnipresent, or there is no such thing as time? Everything just exists.
I like the idea of thinking that time is just an illusion, that time is a man-made construct. But at the same time, I also look at what happens every day with the sun rising, the sun setting, and this passage of something happening. Now, you can say that in the grand scheme of things, that is just a cyclical thing. So by putting time on it, by marking time as related to it, we're really only just appeasing ourselves, because that time doesn't have any other implication except to us. So I'm willing to say that time is not real in that regard. But I don't know that I could also say that would also mean that we can just travel back in time if we so choose. Now, with remote viewing, I've seen many people who have been able to utilize that and actually go back in time or go forward in time. And I didn't know how much I believed it. Last year, actually the end of 2020, I was at an event in West Virginia with Stephanie Burke and her boyfriend, Scott Porter, and we were at the Dunlaura Inn, and she was guiding us through this exercise where she had us kind of remote view the past. And I was totally convinced nothing was going to work, that this is just going to be my mind making it up. But I was brought to a place that felt very, very familiar, but yet I didn't recognize. And I saw 2 people in the driveway, 1940s era. There was a man working on a truck under the hood, and there was a little boy that was hanging out with him. And I could make out the porch that was behind them going into the kitchen of the house and the fence. Like, I could see everything crystal clear. And all that I can think of is there has to have been something that sparked that in me, because I was trying my damnedest not to imagine something. And yet I was taken to this place that I had no explanation for, but yet felt totally familiar to me.
Have you done that again? Have you had an urge to do that again, or was once enough?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to necessarily do that. I would like to be able to try and utilize this as something I could use in investigations, where I could maybe go back to that era of whatever spirit that we're dealing with. I don't know that it's for me necessarily. I think it's an interesting skill for somebody to have and an interesting tool to use on an investigation, but I don't know if I want to exist in 2 different time frames at the same time.
So, Tim, one of my favorite local documentaries is The Bridgewater Triangle. I've watched it several times, and you're in it, I believe, as well as Jeff Belanger and some other people. Can you tell our audience about this special place in Massachusetts? And I think the Oliver House is there as well, and what makes it so unique? Because there is just an amalgam of paranormal activity that is there. not just UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever. There's like a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it really is, everything that you need in the paranormal in one small focused area. The term was originally coined in the late 1970s by Loren Coleman, the cryptozoologist, and he wrote about it in his 1983 book, Mysterious America. And he originally defined it as the three Bridgewaters. There's East Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, and Bridgewater proper. He said that made a natural triangle, and there was a lot of reports coming out of there of different types of paranormal activity. And the Bermuda Triangle was popular at the time, so he just gave it that little name, never really thinking that much about it. Well, lo and behold, 20 years later, there's people who were out there investigating these stories, and they start to realize that they see that same triangle, only it's growing, it's expanding. And I actually define the triangle much larger than most other researchers do. And I do that because I think that it is a living thing that just keeps growing. The more we have this high concentration of reports of ghosts, of UFO sightings, including the first UFOs seen in colonial America, all happening here. What was flying in the sky in the 1600s? It certainly wasn't a blimp. You have the cryptid creatures. You have the true crime that happens here. There's the curses. There's so much stuff that goes on here that it all kinds of blends together and creates what John Keel used to call window areas. And I think that the Bridgewater Triangle is probably one of the most active window areas in the world.
Yeah, it is. I think, beyond that documentary, I think you could almost have a Netflix miniseries on the Bridgewater Triangle because there's so many different angles to cover. Even Pudgewuckies, which some people don't believe in, but there's some people some weird experiences. So I want to wrap up kind of at your beginning because your business card calls you a professional weirdo, by the way, which I love, which is great. But you grew up with some paranormal experiences ranging from the old hag syndrome to strange dreams and even missing time, which could imply maybe an abduction. So I'm curious, could you tell us about some of those early childhood experiences and how they shaped your interest with the, kind of your life journey into the paranormal?
Yeah, I was very much the weird kid. I was the kid that was always going into the 100 section of the library, with the Dewey Decimal System, reading all the paranormal books. But when I was very young, I was like 4 years old, I think, and I had like these dreams, and I'll tell it really quickly. But this dream that I had involved me in my bedroom, which I was terrified of being of and alone anyway. In the dream, there was a ramp to my door, and if you stepped on this one particular board, the sarcophagus that was right next to the door in my dream would then fly open. So I tried to avoid that at all costs. But then in my dream, I step on the board, the sarcophagus opens, there's a mummy inside the sarcophagus. I pull on the bandages and it reveals itself to be Bo Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard, which as a kid, I'm like, oh, it was just Bo Duke in my dream. I love the Dukes of Hazzard. Everything's fine. Years later, I find out, oh no, aliens use your favorite characters as screen memories. So I was like, well, now I'm terrified. But not that long after that, we were camping and I woke up in the tent and I looked over to my parents and they were gone. And I freaked out and I opened the tent and I was looking around for them and they were nowhere to be found. I walked across the campground to another campsite where some people were awake and asked if my parents were there. And they said, no, they're not here. They walked me back to my tent. And when I got to my tent, my parents are in the tent sleeping in their sleeping bag.
Oh.
I've asked them many, many times over the years, like, come on, tell me the truth. Did you guys did you go off to do something in the woods or were you hanging out somewhere else? Like, tell me the truth. And they said, no, we were in that sleeping bag the whole time. So it was just very weird that happened. And then not long after that, I woke up one day just standing in a neighborhood that was a couple streets over from where I lived. And my parents still swear to this day that never happened. But yet I distinctly remember coming home with my parents and later on that same day, my dad putting deadbolts on the front door and sliding bolts at the top so that I couldn't be able to reach them to keep me from being able to leave again. But they say that never happened. So if I think maybe my parents are in on it with the aliens.
Were there deadbolts on your door though after the fact? I mean, but they said it wasn't because of that or
we moved
disappear.
We moved from that house not that long ago. So, I mean, not that long after. So like I haven't, I was 4 years old when I moved out. So like maybe there's the possibility that I have a faulty memory. But I think that there's probably something that they just don't want to tell me. And it wasn't until my aunt and uncle purchased a haunted house inside the Bridgewater Triangle when I was probably about 11 or 12 that I would start sleeping over their house and I would have experiences that really made me realize that this stuff is real, that it's not just the stuff of stories. It's not just me overanalyzing a dream or something. It was real paranormal activity that was happening and it was affecting their family. So I got to see pretty quickly, not only what can actually happen in real life, but the emotional toll it can take on the people that have to endure it.
I know people that purchase haunted houses, and some people can deal with it. Like the S.K. Pierce house, the first people that bought it, the couple were like almost driven out of there. And there was a book written by Joni Mayhan, Bones in the Basement. But, the couple, Ken and Mimi Watson, that kind of renovated it with Mary and Luama, they have a great relationship with the spirits that are there. It did not negatively impact them. I know I've heard of other people that have bought houses that are supposed to be haunted where it really affects their marriage and their mental health and all this stuff. It's almost like addictive, some of these houses where people just don't want to leave, even though it affects their health.
And if I remember right, the house that my aunt and uncle bought, they bought it in the 90s, the early 90s. I think it might have been 89 when they bought it. And the house was only built in like the mid 60s. And in that 20-year period or whatever, there had been 6 different families that had lived in that house. And all 6 marriages had ended in divorce. And my aunt and uncle, they were on the verge. Like my aunt had moved out. My uncle was just basically ready to call it quits on their relationship. And then I forget kind of what happened, but they decided that they had to move, and they moved out into another house in a different town. And once my uncle and my aunt got back together and they lived in this other house, it was like none of that stuff had ever happened. And here it is, 20 something years after that, and they're still together to this day. And I don't know anybody that's as in love as the two of them are. So what is happening in that house was taking its toll on them and driving a wedge between them. But they were able to be the ones to escape it and to avoid having to go down that same fate.
Now, that would be a great Midnight Society show, having a couple, if you could track down some of those couples from that house in Halifax and get them on, if they could share that. That would be interesting.
For 16 years, I've been trying just to get my aunt and uncle and my 2 cousins to come in and tell the story. Like, I got to get to that point, and I've got to go knock on the door of the people that live there now and say, hey, what's going on here? Is there any activity going on? And if so, do you want us to come in and check it out? But I drive by it now and then, and I can just never bring myself to get out of the car and knock on the door and say, hi, I'm Tim. I'm a professional weirdo, and I want to come to your house to look for ghosts.
Yeah. You should have Stephanie or someone else just go and do it. Maybe they'll be more trusting of them.
Yeah, they always love the psychics way more than they love the regular dudes.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, thank you so much. I do want to end with promoting you. I mean, kind of, how can people follow what you're doing? Are you going to be in any Paracons that are coming up? Are there any TV shows? I mean, if they go to IMDb and look you up, you've got like 13 credits and you were an actor in one. What's coming up for you this year, and and also you've written a couple books too. How can people keep following up and learn more about you, and also listening to your 2 shows? Tell them where they can listen to Spooky South Coast. I think there might be 2 ways to do it. There's a classic where they can listen to the older shows, and then there's the newer one which they can get on any platform like Spotify. So go ahead, give us a riff on how we can find out everything about you.
So SpookySouthCoast.com is still out there. We don't really use it that much anymore because people just get the podcast wherever they get it. But we do have over 600 episodes, so there are some podcast feeds that don't catch them all, but some of them do. So you can usually go back and find all those episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And if you run into trouble, you can always email me, Tim@SpookySouthCoast.com. Midnight Society airs Friday nights on Midnight FM. We're on at 10 p.m. Eastern, 10 to midnight. And those archive shows are all subscription-based. That's how we keep Midnight FM working. So you can go and subscribe there to be able to get all those past episodes. And we're up to over 300 episodes of that show now. So actually, I think we're close to 400. So I added it all up recently, and I've done like so many thousands of hours of paranormal talk that it's amazing that I can still find, new questions to ask all the time. And then if you want to check out my books, they're called Ghosts of the South Coast, which is a local history/ghost book. And then the second book I co-authored with Chris Balzano called Haunted Objects, Stories of Ghosts on Your Shelf. So those are both available wherever you get your books and on Amazon. And I've worked on shows like Ghost Asylum, Haunted Towns, Ghost Stalkers. So those are all popping up on Discovery Plus. I did shoot the second season of Hotel Paranormal.
Yep.
I was in season 1, which already aired on the Travel Channel. Season 2 has aired in Canada, but it has not yet aired in the U.S. But I'm assuming that will probably happen soon because, not that it has anything to do with me being on it. The narrator is Dan Aykroyd. So people definitely want to see more of these stories narrated by Dan Aykroyd. So I'm sure that'll be coming down the pike sometime this year too.
And are you going to be any Paracons like Michigan or Gettysburg or anything like that coming up over the next several months?
I'm very excited to be appearing at the Michigan Paracon for the first time this year. So that'll be August 25th through the 27th. And I get to speak with my buddy Tim Dennis from Darkness Radio. So I'm really looking forward to that. And really looking forward to getting to experience Michigan Paracon for the first time. I'm also going to be, doing a lot of my little ghost events that I do around here. I have something coming up at Longfellow's Wayside Inn in April. I have something at the SK Pierce House in June. And then, I'm available. If anybody's throwing a Paracon and you think that you would like to have me as a guest, just reach out to me. Tim@SpookySouthcoast.com is usually the best way. And I am always willing to come and talk. I've got a whole file full of lectures to come and talk about because I just love talking about this stuff. And I love having the interaction with people as they hear it.
Well, that's great. I love talking to you tonight, Tim. I know I met you once. I've heard about you forever. I mean, I definitely wanted to connect with. So I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much. And I look forward to following more of your paranormal journey.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.